494987 Welcome to Eyewitness News, Channel 2 on the WB. Today, before I get started, my name is Josh, and I want to show you my impersonations. This is about Obama. Hey, my name is Barack Obama. In lieu of an actual video, since I wasn't with Andrew, since I was celebrating my anniversary, I'm going to talk about a question everybody has had, well, not everybody, a lot of people have had about cameras and about aperture and ISO and shutter speed and all that jazz. So stay tuned. Come back after the break. Basically, at a very fundamental nutshell level, in order to get a good image for pretty much anything, you need to have a familiarity or a knowledge of aperture or f-stop. That's 1. 2, ISO. And 3, shutter speed. Those are the ones that I manipulate most often. So first off, f-stop, or aperture, as some people call it. That is basically how open the lens is and how much light the lens or the glass, basically the hole inside the lens, how much light that lets in to then touch the film or the sensor, depending on your camera. This would be a very open aperture, or like an f2 or something, so on the lower end of the numbers there. The more I close it, the less light gets in, and that increases the number of the aperture, so f22. I know it's kind of opposite of what would logically be, so this is like an f2, f22. That makes sense? Open, small number, closed, big number. The more closed it is, the less light that gets in, obviously. The more open it is, the more light that gets in. If you want to really filmic look, open your aperture a lot and you get very shallow depth of field, is what they call it. So the distance from the camera to the focus point and then to where it goes out of focus again is very shallow, very short. So if you close the aperture all the way, or a lot, like you usually have to do outside, you get a much crisper, much sharper image, because that's the way science works. So as you can tell right there, that is the ISO of the camera that's currently set. That is the aperture, that's 6.3. And that 80 there is the shutter speed. All this other stuff is stuff for another day. Another big important thing to remember though is that none of this stuff is really manipulatable unless you have that fancy M for manual. So on the 5D, it's just on the top here, and there's a little switch. This little gear mechanism spins. These are all settings you can set it at, like a custom or a preset. I don't really even know what a lot of these other ones do. That is full auto. That's great if you just don't really care and you just want the camera to do all the thinking for you. But manual is fun, and you learn a lot when you're doing it. We have the aperture right down here. That's 6.3. So on the 5D, there's this big wheel on this right hand side of the screen here. That actually directly manipulates the aperture. So if you can tell, as I'm clicking this wheel, this number down here at the bottom is changing. So the higher I go, as you can tell, the darker the image gets, and it opens or it closes all the way down to a 22. The only time you'd ever need a 22 aperture is in, a really bright light or something like that, or if you're going for that effect. As I twist it the other direction, it opens it up, and you can tell that it can get really bright. ISO is the next thing that's also very important. ISO is basically your film sensitivity. So if you have very low ISO, say ISO 100, your film is very not sensitive to light, if that makes sense. And if you pump your ISO up to like 1600 or 22 billion, your film is very sensitive to light. The higher the ISO, the more film grain you have. On the 5D, I push the ISO button. It even gives me a preview up here on the 5D because it's fancy like that. And then I spin the wheel, and it changes. So smaller, higher. And the 5D goes up to some insane number. It's like, yeah, as you can tell, it's 10,000 or something like that. However, you'll notice the image preview, the lower I go, the darker it goes. That's because I'm turning the sensitivity of the film down. When I'm at 100, the image is completely dark almost. There's a few splotches of light around there, but it's almost completely dark. If I turn it up, to something more reasonable, you can tell that the image comes back. That's ISO. That's pretty basic. That's pretty easy to understand. But you always have to remember that the higher your ISO is, so the higher this number is right there, the 1600, the more grain you're going to see throughout your whole image. And the last one is shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically how many times per second that the shutter actually closes and captures light. Okay, it's not frame rate. It doesn't create a new image every time it opens and closes. The slower shutter speed you have, the more motion blur your video will feel. The higher the shutter speed, the more crisp and less motion blur your video will feel. Saving Private Ryan was a film that was shot at a higher shutter speed so that you can really take in all the action. When you pan really quickly with a camera, if your shutter speed is high and you were to pause it right in the middle of that pan, you would see that image very crisply. On most videos though, your shutter speed is low enough that when you pan and you pause right in the middle of it, it's all blurry and blah, blah, blah. So you can kind of dink around with that and test your own camera. The higher the shutter speed you have, the more light you'll need, or the darker your image will get as you increase the shutter speed. So it's this little guy right here. So if you'll notice on the LCD there, this number is changing from, you can open it up to something really high, which is 4,000, which is insane. And if you look at that image now, it's really dark. But you can also open it up to, something really low, like 30. The general rule of thumb is to shoot at roughly twice your frame rate if you want a normal cinematic, filmy looking image. So this 80 down here is probably a pretty good number if you're shooting at like 24 frames a second, which I am. Okay, right there. So, well, I mean, you could even shoot at 50 as your shutter speed, and that'll be fine. As you've been able to tell, there's pros and cons to f-stop, aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, and you kind of have to use them all together and in beautiful synchronous harmony in order to make that work. So, yes. Now, I could explain and show you everything in this video, but really the best way for you guys to learn how to do this is just to go out and do it yourself and kind of experiment with the look and see what you get when you manipulate different values and whatnot. But anyway, be sure to stay tuned. Don't fear. This is not how it's going to be for the rest of the time. I know you guys want to see Andrew. I want to see him too. He's very attractive. But next week we have a very cool video coming out that we've been shooting all this week, and we'll continue shooting after that. But it's basically, I don't want to give too much away, but it's a skateboarding video, and I'll have a little preview play right now. Whoa, that was great. That was so cool. So yeah, stay tuned for that. It's going to be a lot of fun. Yep. See you next time.